America. He came from the United States, from California to the University of Tilburg for a couple of master classes. He's in Holland for just 2 weeks, and we're really happy that we could take a day off that he had. We reserved him for this lecture. We gave everybody a biography of his work, and we hope that you had the time to read it, and I hope you will enjoy the lecture. Professor?
Thank you very much, and thank you for coming today. I think just to give credit where credit is due, at the University of Tilburg, I am for the visiting professor of Islam and citizenship, and that's the context of my visit to the Netherlands. I want to start today's lecture with a concept from Islamic eschatology, or Islamic theology, if you will. A concept that all Muslims would be familiar with, and perhaps people who know something about Islam as well. And that is the idea of jahiliyyah, the idea of jahl or jahiliyyah. The concept is deceptively straightforward enough. State of jahl means ignorance, heedlessness, lack of awareness, perhaps even linguistically idiocy or foolishness. But there's a clear connotation of the perverse, pernicious, the dark, the foreboding, and inauspicious. In Islamic eschatology, it is common to refer to people plagued by ignorance, injustice, cruelty, hatred, as a people living in a state of jahiliyyah, or a condition of jahiliyyah. Ingratitude, selfishness, arrogance are thought as well to be characteristics of jahiliyyah, as well as the prevalence of vice and inequity in any society. Of course, from this point of view of the concept of jahiliyyah, jahiliyyah has been entrenched in human history and human societies as the social ailments of bigotry, racism, hatred, and oppression themselves. Furthermore, within every epoch of human history, you find its forms of jahiliyyah. For me, I find part of the enduring legacy of Islam, because in my understanding, Islam is submission and surrender only to God, and it is resistance and rebellion against the personal jahiliyyah of the iniquitous and uprooted soul, and against social conditions and structures that compel the sufferance of ignorance and hatred, and that ultimately deny human beings a fair chance to come out. In my view, the theology of Islam resists the state of jahiliyyah by calling upon human beings to wage a relentless jihad struggle in pursuit of enlightenment and against the oppressiveness of ignorance and against the social and political deformities and illnesses that spread in the absence of justice. The jihad against jahiliyyah, as I call it, is a constant struggle to bring balance and peace to one's own soul, first and foremost, and to pursue balance and peace for one's society and then for humanity at large. In other words, in this view, it is jihad to bring justice within and without, for oneself and for all of humanity. This jihad is a never-ending effort at self-enlightenment, as well as the pursuit of enlightenment at the communitarian and social level. In Islamic theology, A Muslim is in a state of constant resistance to the state of jahl and the disease in Islamic imagery of jahiliyyah. In a sense, in struggling to submit to the Almighty, a Muslim struggles for liberation from and against falling captive to godlessness. Godness is not just a conviction or belief. In my view, it is a state of being. And this state, which is quintessentially interconnected with the notions of beauty, with the attributes of divinity such as love, mercy, justice, tranquility, humility, and peace, is in direct antipathy to the state of jahiliyyah, which in turn is associated with the ailments suffered in a state of godlessness, such as hate, cruelty, inequity, arrogance, anxiety, fear, and uprootedness. I started out by arguing that every epoch, every period suffers its own jahiliyyah. But what is distinctive about the moral failures of our own age is not their nature or kind. Indeed, the moral failures of our age remain rather disparagingly similar to past ages. What is different, however, about our age is that while the moral failures remain the same, more than any other time in the past, these same failures, these jahiliyas as I call them, are more inexcusable and less understandable than any time in history. Human beings continue to suffer from ignorance, but our ability to teach, learn, and communicate is better than any previous age. We continue to suffer from hate, bigotry, and racism, but our knowledge of human sociology, anthropology, and history, our collective experiences as human beings, make these failures less excusable, less understandable, and then leave alone excusable than in any other time in history. And I emphasize in any other time in history. We continue to wage war and slaughter each other. That's a moral failure. But at the same time, our ability to kill and cause destruction is more lethal and dangerous than any other time in history. Yet, our codependence on each other as human beings and our increasingly interlinked world, in addition to the unprecedented dangers posed by our own weapons, make our constant resort to war and violence incoherent and incomprehensible, and definitely, in my view, less forgivable than any time in history. In this age, in my view, the problem is not our technical abilities or our know-how. The problem, in short, is in our will, our sense of purpose, our normative values, and indeed in our very comprehension of humanness. Paradoxically, while our collective sense of the humane, our understanding of rights, denial, and suffering has improved, and while our technical ability to protect rights or remove suffering has also been augmented, our ability to get beyond our isolation and own limitations as individuals, and to reach for the transcendental and perennial in what is human, has significantly deteriorated. Perhaps this is why so many philosophers of the modern age have described the contemporary age, or postmodernity, as the age of anxiety, restlessness, uprootedness, or groundlessness. Indeed, the predicament of the modern age has been that while our intellectual capacities have sprung forth by leaps and bounds, our spiritual abilities, to say the least, have not. Our ability to access information about each other and to collect and organize data about our world has given us a greater sense of control and has raised our expectations as human beings. But all of this has done little to raise our sense of consciousness. We can see more of our world and further into the universe than any other time in history. Our failure to decipher and perceive the truth of reality, leave alone beauty, has only grown more intense and also more and more inexcusable. In Islamic thought, we tend to see religion and religiosity as fundamentally antithetical to a state of Jahiliyyah and all the ugliness that it represents in Islamic eschatology. There's no doubt that throughout human history, religion has been a powerful instigator of change. In fact, religion has possessed the power of truly transformative moments in history. Not too many forces in history have recognized the positive and, in my view, necessary role that religion ought to play in remedying many of the ailments suffered in modernity. However, for any true believer, a believer who does not go through the affectations of belief, but a person who has felt anchored, inspired, and empowered by belief, and to me that is what a true believer is, for that believer who, because of his or her religious convictions, was able to reach out for godliness, for the perennial, for the transcendental, the sublime, and the beautiful, for that kind of believer, there is no alternative to fending off the Jahiliyyah of modernity or of any other age for that matter. There is no possibility to fending off the Jahiliyyah of this or any other age without the empowerment and enlightenment of faith from the point of view of that believer. It is precisely for the believer whose engagement with the divine has translated into nothing but a sense of beauty, peace, balance, and mercy. Sense of beauty, peace, balance, and mercy, that a particular kind of Jahiliyyah is more offensive than all others. This Jahiliyyah of which I speak, which to me is more offensive than all others, is instigated and perpetuated in the name of religion itself. It is when religion is usurped and turned into an instrument of hatred, bigotry, prejudice, ignorance, suffering, ugliness, is when this act of usurpation takes place. As a believer, this deeply offends me, because more than ever before, I feel that humanity needs the love, mercy, and light of the divine. To use religion to perpetuate a state of godlessness, is to say the least offensive. But from the perspective of a Muslim, or as a Muslim, the perpetuation of Jahiliyyah, or a state of Jahiliyyah, in the name of Islam itself, is more than offensive. From my perspective, it is an abomination. It is a complete breakdown in the logic and rationale of existence itself. As a Muslim, I think of this abomination as a fundamental and inherent contradiction in terms. The two cannot exist. In fact, the two cannot coexist, because the illuminations of God cannot exist or coexist with the darkness of Jahiliyyah. But I must admit at the same time that I find the Jahiliyyah, that one Jahiliyyah begets another. Yet the Jahiliyyah in the name of Islam, from my perspective, is simply grotesque. Yet, at the same time, I find the rather widespread and sadly trendy Jahiliyyah of Islam haters and Islamophobes and prejudice against Muslims very disturbing. Before coming here, I questioned whether the relevance of the discourse on the Jahiliyyah of the Islamic is only to, of course, to be met by the election results and Wilder's wonderful speech in Denmark. So that does form a backdrop to this lecture. By my own training and my education as a Muslim jurist, I am accustomed to dealing with those who hate in Islam's name by challenging their convictions and arguments with theological and jurisprudential disputations. That is what I do. And for most of my years, I focused all my teaching and writing on challenging and deconstructing the beliefs and claims of Muslim bigots, or bigots in the name of Islam. However, Islam hating, or Islamophobia, poses its own exceptional challenges. Not only am I not trained to deal with the irrational rage of Islam haters in this day and age, Islamophobia simply leaves the modern with a sense of the intractable, with an intractable sense of despair and even hopelessness. Of course, Islam hating enjoys a long and firmly established pedigree, as does hating in the name of Islam. Both are rather practices rich in tradition, rich with tradition. Western society often knows hating in the name of Islam, and that's what I've dedicated most of my career to. But today, I will focus on the other type of challenge, hating Islam. Starting with the very early Muslim challenge to the dominance and hegemony of the Persian and Byzantine superpowers 1400 years ago, Islam has been the subject of well-documented socio-cultural processes of antagonism. Indeed, it was not very long that in response to the spread of Islam, sometimes through the practices, or quite often through the practices of Muslims themselves, but that's immaterial, there developed a defensive, elaborate institutional practice within Christian societies. Of course, what supported this institutional practice within Christian societies was a tradition, I would say a tradition of theological and ideological dogma ignited by a web of anxieties, whether these anxieties are cultural or political. In summary, the feeling of being threatened. The function performed by this institutional practice was defensive and reactive, to say the least. It sought to contain what it saw as a threat of Islam, not only by promoting cultures plagued by a sense of siege, but even more, by a sense of revulsion and outrage at the Muslim heathen. The same processes that constructed the archetypal Muslim who induced fear also nurtured a mythology of a culture at the brink of suffering God's wrath and damnation because of the success of that Muslim heathen. Leading up to the beginning of the Western Crusades, narratives of piety and anti-heresy reinforced that without adequate private and public performances of outrage at the infidel Muslim and the infidel society, risked incurring God's vengeance, wrath, and even damnation. Some contemporary historians have even argued, Western historians for the most part, that the very idea of the West, the very notion of the abode of Christendom, was, of course, historically embedded to the institutions of Catholicism in particular, as a unit defined, Christendom as a unit defined by a coherent identity, cultural unity, and a basic set of shared political interests developed in direct response to the rise of the Islamic civilization. Feeling challenged, threatened, also defeated, the West, with its reactively formed identity, perhaps had no choice but to develop narratives of fear and self-preservation directed against Muslims and Islam. In these narratives of fear, anxiety, and obsession, narratives that stereotyped, exaggerated, and demonized the Muslim as a symbolic construct, Islam is cast into the role of the eminent and everlasting threat, and the Muslim does not just embody the image of the enemy, but is made into the proverbial boogeyman. The infidel whose very existence, leave alone the infidel's successes and victories, is a horrific blasphemy and outrage against God, king, and church. Indeed, in feudalistic Europe, at a time when political dissent, blasphemy, and heresy were hardly differentiated from one another, Islam was seen as an atrocity against God and majesty. The very cause of divine wrath and damnation. It took the West, led by the Catholic Church, about 4 centuries of sacred rage to build up the frenzy of intolerance and hate that would fire up and sustain 6 centuries of the waves of Western invasion of Muslim lands, now known collectively as the Crusades. Contrary to popular beliefs, of course, the Crusades did not just target the Holy Land or Jerusalem, but included Andalusia, eventually Granada, Syria, Egypt, Tunisia, Morocco, and even the Eastern Orthodox Church of Constantinople, and, of course, the Jews of the East. Eventually, the repeated invasion of the Crusaders were defeated, but not before leaving a trail of fear and hate that eventually culminated, a Muslim version of fear and hate that eventually culminated in the Ottoman invasions of Eastern Europe. Now, hardly had the Ottoman invasions been repulsed and defeated, incidentally without much help from Western Europe, when a new chapter of religious bigotry and hatred had been perpetuated through the pseudo-religious culture of Western colonialism and its brainchild movement, in my view, Orientalism. Now, all of this, in a sense, is in the past, because as decolonization or decolonization movements surged and nations gained the right to national liberation and self-determination, humanity seemed to be on the verge of unprecedented advancements in finally becoming united over core values, among them tolerance as a necessary and compelling ethical virtue. Of course, I'm not claiming that when nations and governments were busily adopting or ratifying or affirming the UN Charter or the Universal Declaration of Human Rights or many other international treaties in the period of the 1940s and 1950s, that, among other things, banning racial discrimination, racial bigotry, gender inequality, that these governments actually meant to implement what they pledged themselves to do, that would be just simply naive. The reality, especially from the Muslim point, is that the rise of contemporary regimes of human rights and humanitarian institutions and laws, however, was and is replete with unresolved and paradoxical tensions. For Muslims emerging from the hypocritically enlightened and, in my view, pathologically self-righteous, but invariably also exploitative, dungeons of colonialism onto a new age radiating with the glitter of principles such as the right to self-determination, national liberation, non-intervention, and to prohibition against the use of force, the world must have looked very promising but also confusing. Promising, I think, is obvious. Confusing is a byproduct of the Cold War and the hypocrisies that are elicited and necessary to the ideology of political realism and realpolitik. Now, it is understandable that within these tensions is a factory for confusion and bitterness, when, especially among those who struggle with the aggressive reality of hegemonic imperialism. But from the very inception of the Age of Rights, actually to something that is rather obvious, but must, at the same time, a lot of Muslims would recognize it, that at the same time that this age of promise is coming to be, and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is adopted in 1948, of course that's the same year in which Palestinians become people dispossessed. So, the mixed moment. All of this invariably did cast doubt upon the credibility and integrity of contemporary ethical universalisms and their inclusiveness towards Muslims. I think it would be disingenuous to claim otherwise. Nevertheless, regardless of the challenges and contradictions that confronted Muslims in this age, there is no question that as human beings moved through the 20th century and advanced to the 21st century, there were tangible successes in that, on principle, finally, there was collective recognition of the wrongfulness and immorality of certain ailments, or what I call jahiliyas. Racism, ethnocentrism, bigotry, as well as religious and cultural intolerance, among other vices, as well as, in principle, recognizing a collective recognition and admission that all human beings are at a minimum entitled to life, security, freedom, and dignity. In other words, in the post-colonial era, and especially by the time we reached the end of the colonial war, the Cold War, by the time we reached the end of the Cold War, it looked like, after centuries of creating and suffering so much man-made misery, at least there were concrete and tangible achievements. Finally, human beings have learned something worthwhile. This is what I find exactly despairing about religious bigotry. It is an indication that, after all, perhaps we've learned nothing. It is distressing to think that despite the horrendous history of senseless slaughter and persecution, human beings, which of course go through massive genocides against native cultures, massive invasions of societies, fear and crusades, and the whole legacy of colonialism and the destruction of native cultures, and of course the obscenity of slavery and so on. You're all familiar with that, so I don't need to go through it. But it is distressing to think that despite the horrendous history of the senseless slaughter and human suffering, that humans, after all, have not developed higher states of consciousness. States of consciousness that are more reflective and balanced senses of being. But that they only grow ever more sophisticated in obfuscating the difference between reality and dreams, but their states of consciousness remain unchanged. The currently trendy phenomena of Islamophobia, and rather the lucrative business of Islam slamming, I could become very rich if I become an Islam hater, rather ominously condemn us to recycling history through the same irrational processes of reciprocated hate. But it is much more than the fear of repeating history that, in my opinion, is at stake here. Today is not like yesterday, and tomorrow will be even more different. Muslims are no longer the representatives of a dominant civilization and are not co-participants in defining the norms of our lived world. No part of the Muslim world could be considered coherent units of integrated economic and political power